Good afternoon, everybody, all over. Welcome you to the session, the importance of food markets at the Market Access Africa 2021 session hosted by the African Agri Council. It's my privilege today to speak to you next 20 minutes or so about a couple of themes that the work that we've been doing in combination with some of the themes that emerged out of the session that we've witnessed the last day or so. I think there's a lot to be said about this problem of development agriculture. There's a lot to be said about the challenges that we face. And there's also a lot to say about our response to these challenges that we noted. I think the first point really is that I don't think we understand the problem, and that's really the message that I want to leave with people today, is to go and think really hard about the problem that we are all facing. So the question is why markets are failing development agriculture, and that's a statement, a question that's been mulling in my head. We hear a lot about solutions. We hear a lot about solutions that intend to solve this problem, food security, 9 billion people, Africa is the food basket, etc. But that's not a new story. I mean, that's been around for some time now, officially documented probably about 15 years ago. So prior to that, the problem of development agriculture, of developing primary agriculture, and with this dream of taking primary agriculture into the mainstream of sophisticated value chains. Right, so I call this session the hot potato session, because I feel that there's this outstanding problem and that we are kicking it around. So we'll return to these questions after I'm done. But firstly, I think we have to ask the question whether or not we are doing well or not. After billions of dollars that's gone into development agriculture, that has flowed into value chain development, primary offtake initiatives, export initiatives, etc. Where are we really? If we look back at our model, has it really had the large, broad-scale impact that it's intended to have? Yes, there's been pockets of excellence, very good examples of people that have made some real impact within certain communities and within certain lines. But are we really at the point where we can scale up? And that's what I want to share with you, the insights today about the methodology and the roadmap that we keep ourselves busy with, to make a contribution to this problem, to make a contribution to ask and to answer the high-level question of how do we scale development agriculture up, and how do we turn that in the transformative driver for economic growth and for social change that it promises to be. So my statement currently is that I don't think our markets are benefiting development agriculture at all to the stage that it should be, if we look back at how long we've been at it. Right, so just to illustrate that point, I want colleagues to think about the problem as follows, and that we typically end up with public interventions and private interventions. So through the speeches of this event, you've got different stakeholders that are looking at this problem. You've got public facing institutions that are trying to have an impact, be it political and social, on the communities. On the private side, you've got private companies that are flowing into the agricultural space, trying to introduce interventions to solve this problem. Our outcomes, on the public side, there are social outcomes, and on the commercial side, there's commercial outcomes. But at the end of the day, we serve the same set of beneficiaries. But these two forces are not aligned, as you can imagine. Although we serve the same communities, I think the results show that from an outcomes point of view, we are not there yet. So there's a misalignment, I think, between the public interventions that are introduced and the private parties and their agendas. And I expand on that with this slide to say that if we look at the outcomes, let's look at this as a model. And we say that on the outcomes side, we've still have poverty, malnutrition. There's still questions about access to food, the level of job creation and economic growth that specifically the agricultural sector should have unlocked by now. But think about that, even in South Africa, where we're talking about a country that, and we want to pride ourselves on our fantastic farmers, fantastic production levels that we can that we can produce in this country, our ability to produce a wide variety of products at different volumes and also at different quality standards, world-class agriculture in this country. But we sit with this anomaly. Why are people malnutritioned in this country? It says to you that there's something wrong with the model. The outcomes are showing us that the public-private interactions are not having the desired effects. Now, if we look at a couple of the drivers, and I just listed a couple of them just to illustrate what I mean. So if we look at the concept of economies of scale, we look at institutional friction, profitability, institutional IP, funding and investment. If you put that in the court of the public sector, those elements have got different dynamics. Not because the concept is different, but because of the bureaucracy that you deal with within the public sphere. If you go to the private side, the same bureaucracies have got the outcome of all those different variables have got a different impact. So economies of scale, for instance, if you look at private institutions, their drive is to get economies of scale, to get product down. We just heard from one of the speakers the story about the development agriculture and cabbage. A simple example where arguably this the growers within a very successful development agriculture project cannot produce their product at the same cost, low cost that a big private business farmer, large-scale farmer can produce. So you see already, if we look at economies of scale, there's something we need to keep in mind here. If we look at the two types of interventions, we have to recognize that there's a lot less institutional friction for a private enterprise. So a private enterprise gets involved in a value chain and ultimately has got the ability to integrate, build warehouses. We've heard today about private initiatives, value chain initiatives, platforms, e-commerce. They've got the ability to make risk-based decisions within a very small group. If you're looking at institutional friction in the public sector, I mean, that is a completely different ballgame where things have to go out on tender process. You've got lengthy tender processes. You've got tender allocation. You've got fraud. You've got all of that. So the institutional friction means that our private interventions has got the ability to be a lot more efficient with what they do, but they have to drive a profitability metric in order to be sustainable. Where government's focus is more on the social and let's call it a more grant-based approach, private institutions needs to be profitable. And that brings a lot of realities to the table. It brings the whole thing about competition to the table, institutional IP that needs to be protected. And then ultimately, the realities around putting money on the table and making things work. So that means from a private institution side, when you look at your beneficiaries, are you looking at them as clients or voters? Meaning, are you looking at them as potential people that you can benefit from commercially, or are you looking at at them from a public sector are benefiting on as a political currency. Now we know that agriculture in countries are political currency, and it's in certain sectors, in certain countries, that's much more concentrated on certain commodity lines. But as you can see, the point I'm making is that public interventions and private interventions are not the same thing, and they are inherently different in conflict, I would argue, with each other. And that's why when we look at our outcomes, when we look at this hot potato of how do we solve small-scale agriculture, development agriculture, there is a need to structure this public-private combination in order to unlock the value at the top. So keep that in mind when you reflect on the speeches today, and keep this image in mind that these interventions, be it from a couple of examples in KZN was raised over the last 2 days, they are public interventions, and they are typically built around a specific structure and framework, whereas the private ones are not. And I would argue that the disconnect between these two is what causes the outcomes not to be there and the results not to be there. So if I take that one step further, and just to give it a value chain dimension, if you look at the simple principles of value chain development, you make things, you add value, and then you sell them. And a lot of the solutions, and specifically if you look in the middle around the technology, infrastructure, logistics, and money, those things are present in any value chain. And the realities are that you have to solve those problems if you want product to flow and money to flow. There's a lot of micro solutions, and technology, I feel, is specifically guilty of this. Because a lot of emphasis is placed on the technological solutions, solving problems, in my view, that are not as high priority to make this flow of product and money work. Because at the end of the day, 80% of the dynamics within a value chain is non-technological related. That is around relationships, around pricing, around the physical contracts, etc., and scaling up. The physicality of the product means that it pushes you into a physical environment where technology plays a role, but not the total role. And I think that's why, if you think about the Uber concept in agriculture, that's why we haven't seen a lot of offtake, large-scale offtake of an impact of those solutions, because they're not addressing the real core problems. You always have a political element, economical reality, a regulatory reality, a technical reality, and a social reality. Doesn't matter where you are. Those realities are there. And at the end of the day, I'm afraid to say, because we haven't got that tied up, we've got a disconnect back to the production side, back to the grower that's still growing his product and wondering what on earth is happening up the value chain. I'll lead this to the story of the tragedy of the commons. And the story of the tragedy of the commons is an important lesson, even in South Africa, of how you potentially could establish a commons like that. And the South African, if I refer to the South African fresh produce market model, it is a model for how you do structure a public-private environment, that it does have multiplier effects up and down the value chain. But unfortunately, South Africa's commission system is also and has become a case study for what happens when this economic concept of the tragedy of the commons starts to play itself out, where there's large-scale exploitation, mismanagement, misalignment, and at the end of the day, it leads to the destruction and the fragmentation of something that's potentially beneficial to the public. Now, the tragedy of the commons, please go and Google that. It's a concept that says there's a public-facing entity, a public good. Think about roads, think about water provision, etc. Typically, public goods that are provided by a government, because private enterprise does not, it's not part of their mandate or their business plan to provide goods that are important to benefit all in the community, right? So the markets in South Africa pretty much can be seen as a public good, but public good in the sense that it's got a very unique business model which creates this environment that I relate to as the tragedy of the commons. And what you'd see is, and over the last 15 years and probably escalated the last 5 years, there's been a general exploitation of that tragedy of the commons, where the benefit of the commons is used for personal benefit. And that slide that I showed you here, this starts to eat away at the potential social good. So although South Africa's model has been hailed as an example of a future model, it's potentially not as it stands. In South Africa, we have not solved problems relating to development agriculture, which we absolutely should have solved with this model. And again, I'm going back here, because this model was created years ago with the specific intention of creating a very specific outcome. That's to create a low-cost, low-risk offtake point for growers. It worked. It worked spectacularly well, right? But as it stands at the moment, we have a scenario where it's not leading, it has not delivered on that. And I would argue that it's because of the personal interest of private enterprise and then the typical bureaucratic overhead that you find from a government side. So a good case study to study. There's a lot to learn from the South African example, but not a copy and paste as it stands at the moment. I'm going to conclude a couple of key findings. I'm going to return to some of the questions that I raised in the beginning. And I want to, and I say again, raise the question, are we doing well? Are we really successful? And I think we, in retrospect, have to say we are not successful. We have to say that it's not my problem attitude within commerce in general, but then specifically as far as solving this development problem. One of the benefits, I think, of this whole problem and the problem of agriculture and food security, and that it's the focus on it has meant that a lot of clever money has gone into it, meaning there's a lot of focus of a lot of clever people on it. And I think that hopefully would give us a marginal benefit. But as I've indicated, I don't think that alone is enough. I don't think fancy technology from overseas is enough. I don't think the value chain, integrated value chains that we look at in other countries is enough. We have to think about this problem differently. I think the natural forces in any value chain, cost, barriers, quality, safety, price, I mean, that's been highlighted. You could hear people refer to costs. What's your cost? Doesn't matter how fancy your smartphone app is, but what's your cost and how does that compare? We have to say that price is important, and the ability to get the right price to stay in business, that's important. There are very real things within a supply chain that kicks out the small scale grower if you are not competitive. I mentioned the public-private partnership and the whole development mandate and the alignment between those. We need to come together. I quote the person from Syngenta. He said we need more collective and corrective actions. So he's pointing to the fact that there is this disconnect within the value chain that's leading to inefficiencies. So we need to note that. We have to make sure that we have an ideological alignment, meaning that if we're going to benefit small-scale growers, then we're going to benefit them, right? And that needs to be in there. It does not work if you do if you've got a commercial mandate that looks at exploiting a specific value chain. When in actual fact, you need a development mandate. I include the concept of institutional narcissism. It's a strong term, but it points to the fact that institutions serve their stakeholders. And if your stakeholder is not, if your shareholder rather, is not the small-scale grower, then ultimately your actions are going to show that. And again, the session that was just now earlier on today highlighted the fact that if retail, for instance, with all their grower programs, have not had the ability to show large-scale impact on the development sphere, and the model that I propose is exactly for that reason, that you've got private enterprise and they are not there to solve development problems firstly and solve problems that benefits other people or their competition. So that narrow focus is what I would term institutional narcissism, which kicks out this the small-scale guide. Platform issue and transparency. I question the fact that if we talk about platforms and transparency, where you can call them together, but put them together in the same sentence. In South Africa, I think we've got probably one of the best examples of how transparency looks. We've also got one of the best examples, as I said to you, a case study of what happens if you privatize your value chain. Then transparency goes out of the window. Transparency, the word transparency is fine to mention, but that's transparency to who? When we talk about development, we talk about the public-facing side of it. I would argue there is no transparency around platforms. They do not generically and willingly share their information as an example that we do in South Africa across the public markets, where that's baked into the cake for a very specific reason, because that's the true form of transparency. So the fact that you've got a new platform, it doesn't mean you're transparent. Any platform internally is transparent to its participants, but in South Africa, as far as the municipal markets are concerned, the model is focused specifically at creating broader-based transparency than just to the participants. Infrastructure, process, and people. And with infrastructure, I mean technology. I think that one of the key findings is that process and people are the important things to focus on, and that you can't copy and paste. That the technology focus, as wonderful as it is, it puts the focus on the wrong elements within the value chain, and hence we don't see the outcome. So in conclusion, we need an adjustment in our approach, and I think there's definitely more. It deserves a little bit more empirical work for us to really understand this problem. So with that, I will conclude. I will look at the chat line for any questions if there are. Otherwise, I thank you and I wish you a lovely day. Goodbye.